Hi class. So today we're going to talk real briefly about the second reading we had for this week. It's an essay by a really famous cultural anthropologist, um, sexual rights activist, and really important thinker when we think of sex politics, named Gail Rubin. So Gail Rubin is a cultural anthropologist. She works at University of Michigan, where she's a full professor, but also she just has a lot to say about really important things about the politics of sexuality. Um, Again, we're dealing here with someone who is writing pre-AIDS era. So really in this first week of class, we're trying to address topics that really help us understand queer theory before HIV/AIDS gets introduced, because HIV/AIDS really does influence how we think of queer theory, but it does so in a way that changes queer theory, but is also influenced by queer theory. And so that's why I think it's important we read some sort of foundational queer theorists like Foucault, like Gail Rubin. So today we're actually going to be reading this essay, a very famous essay in queer theory called Thinking Sex. And the subtitle is Notes for Radical Theory of the Politics of Sexuality. Interestingly enough, this essay was written in 1984, which is about maybe 5 years after Foucault published his History of Sexuality, Volume 1, in French, and it wasn't translated in English until maybe 2 or 3 years later. So we're dealing with an essay that's happening kind of contemporaneously with Foucault's work. And Gail, you'll see in Rubin's text that she sort of, in a way, builds on what Foucault was working on, because Foucault really famously makes a lot of thoughts about queer theory and thoughts about sexuality more broadly possible. But when we think about thinking sex, really what's happening is, in this essay, Rubin is talking about how social groups in certain systems attribute value, and political value in particular, to sexuality, which then goes on to define certain behaviors as good and bad, or unnatural, and sort of how this influences us as political and social beings. One thing in particular we'll definitely talk about today is this idea called the charmed circle. I think you saw the graph. It's a circle, and there's an inside and an outside, and how for every sex practice or sex act, there's a good version of that and a bad version of that. I think it's important that Rubin is thinking sort of beyond just sort of homosexual sex acts, right? I mean, that's clearly what she's thinking about, but also more. I mean, so Rubin's PhD dissertation, actually, interestingly, I think this is really fascinating. Interestingly enough, was on leather culture in San Francisco. So she's really interested in really subversive, or what mainstream heterosexual culture might call perverse, sex acts, and sort of how we come to terms with perverse sex acts. So let's jump into the text. I want to start out by reading the first sentence of the second paragraph of the text. I think it's really important to outline what we're doing with sort of politics and sexuality. So she says that the realm of sexuality also has its own internal politics, iniquities, and modes of oppression. As with other aspects of human behavior, the concrete institutional forms of sexuality at any given time and place are products of human activity. They are imbued with conflicts of interest and political maneuver, both deliberate and incidental. In that sense, sex is always political. But there are also historical periods in which sexuality is more sharply contested and more overtly politicized. In such periods, the domain of erotic life is, in effect, renegotiated. So this is really important and interesting, right? Because what Rubin is trying to say is we can't think of sex purely in terms of biology or in terms of science, or the science of sexuality, or even the psychology of sexuality, right? So we have, for example, on one end, Alfred Kinsey. I'm sure you've all heard of the Kinsey scale, right, where a certain percentage of people are straight, a certain percentage of people are gay, and everyone else is sort of on this scale of sexuality. Then we have the biological understanding of sex, right? But for Rubin, underlying all this is a politics. And so we can't really limit sexuality strictly to biology and strictly to psychology, right? There's something political about sex and sort of how we experience sex. And this is important when we think about AIDS as well, because in terms of AIDS is not merely biological or merely medical. It is absolutely a political experience. So when we talk about HIV/AIDS as a crisis, and HIV/AIDS as sort of experience, we have to think about it not only as biological and medical, but more particularly as political. But anyway, for Rubin, sex and sexuality is political. So as we move on a little bit, I think that she sort of starts. What I want to say is we need to really begin by understanding the context in which Rubin is writing, right? And I think this context is also important. This historical context is also important to understanding where we're going to go in terms of HIV/AIDS as well. So, right, Rubin is writing in '84, and what happens, the decade before, or the 15 years leading up to 1984? Well, we have what's called the sexual liberation movements. So, the sexual liberation movements kind of pair up with the women's liberation movements and the gay liberation movements, and these are important because what happens in these movements are people say we no longer have to be defined in terms of heterosexual norms. We no longer have to merely follow heterosexual norms of marriage, heterosexual norms of dating, heterosexual norms of sex and sexuality, waiting till marriage to have sex, or only having sex with a man and a woman, or only having vaginal intercourse, right? These are the things that people are saying we don't have to follow these norms of sex and sexuality. And so with Rubin, she wants to say that the two eras in which you really see this radical sexuality start to be reimagined or reinvigorated is first in the 1880s, right? We talked about that a few days ago with Foucault. That's the Victorian era redefinition of sexuality. And then again in the 1950s. So in the 1950s, we see sort of a strict institutionalization of gender roles. Women stay in the home, men go and work, women cook. And this sort of applies then also to how we think of sex and sexuality. And the sexual liberation movement of the 70s is a rejection of the 1950s reinvigoration of Victorian era gender and sexual norms. And so what you see in the 70s is a movement to say there are other forms of sex and other forms of sexuality that are good, that aren't sort of strictly heterosexual. But, of course, heterosexual society responds to this by rejecting this. And so what you see are certain sex acts labeled as good and certain sex acts labeled as bad, but not just bad, right? So I think the first instance of this is you see the rising of the term sex offender. So when you look at the word sex offender, this was a term that was not only applied to pedophilia or people who sexually assaulted individuals or people who didn't get consent before sex, right? Consent is very important. We'll talk about that later. But it was also applied to other deviant modes of sexuality. So, for example, gay teachers. Gay teachers were considered sex offenders, or in some cases could be fired for being gay, because we had to protect the children. And so you see certain rhetoric arise around the politics of sexuality. Protect the children from gays, from people who might do them harm, who might teach them about sexuality. So you see this movement happen. And so I think moving forward a little bit, I think that the first section really talks about this introduction to sexual politics. So if we go to the last, to page 148 in the text, about the third paragraph up from the bottom, she says, periods such as the 1880s in England and the 1950s in the United States recodified the relations of sexuality. The struggles that were fought leave a residue in the form of laws, social practices, and ideologies, which then affect the way in which sexuality is experienced long after the immediate conflicts have faded. All the signs indicate that the present era is another of those watersheds in the politics of sex. The settlements that emerged from the 1980s will have an impact far into the future. It is therefore imperative to understand what is going on and what is at stake in order to make informed decisions about what policies to support and oppose. Right? So what she's saying is that in the 1880s and the 1950s, you see a movement against sex and sexuality. And what happens in that movement is laws and norms are put into place to protect against deviancy. Right? We talked about this with bourgeois society 2 days ago, and we're seeing it again with Rubin in the 1950s. And we need to understand this because we need to understand that laws against sex and sexuality are never just about sex and sexuality. They're about control. And they always have relations to social control. And so what you see as we move forward is really Rubin taking movements to underline the problems of the oppressions of sexual politics. And so we see her label sort of the four, or sorry, actually there's 5 ways in which sexual politics can be oppressive. The first being sexual essentialism, right? Sexual essentialism, I think, is the most obvious one. So sexual essentialism is just the idea that there's one right way to have sex, right? And typically when we think of the one right way to have sex, we think of vaginal intercourse. Not oral sex, not masturbation, vaginal intercourse. And I think that's important. Because that eliminates a lot of sexual experiences, a lot of people who do various different types. And actually, when I say vaginal intercourse, we've got to be even more specific, because we mean a vagina being penetrated by a penis, period. But then there are other forms of oppressions. The first she talks about is sex negativity. This is just the idea that if you're having sex, you're presumed to be guilty, right? You're not supposed to have sex until you're married. If you're having sex, you're a bad person. Sex represents sort of character flaws, right? So the second thing is the fall of the misplaced scale, or the fallacy of the misplaced scale. And what she means by this is that we view sexual taste differences far differently than we view other taste differences. So if we think of sexual tastes in terms of like our taste we have for food, right? If someone doesn't like my food that I cook because it's too spicy, I don't go, gasp, you should be banned from my home because you won't eat my food because you don't like the spicy food that I like. But when it comes to sexual tastes, for some reason, we feel the need to really enliven this scale to say, oh, you don't want to have sex the way I want to have sex, you must be bad. Your character must be flawed. And so you see this sort of emphasis placed on sexual tastes to make it far more significant than it really is. So the third one deals with the hierarchical system of sexual value. And this just has to do with what we talked about last week, right? So in heterosexual bourgeois society, reproductive sex is valued to the highest extent and to the greatest extent. And this is because reproductive sex reproduces, but also because heterosexuals have the power to sort of define the normalized way in having sex. And so any sexual behaviors that fall lower on this scale of sexual behaviors, such as homosexuality, bestiality, leather, BDSM, these sorts of sexual acts are viewed as lesser or as not real sex. And you'll see them oftentimes referred to as not real sex. Right? The real sex is penile penetration of the vagina. Heterosexual sex. And I think she also draws something really important here I want to point out. Then she just talks about how a lot of this is linked up with desire, right? It's not that the sex act necessarily is bad, though it's not good. It's bad because it has an unfit desire, so the desire is wrong. You're not supposed to desire, a man isn't supposed to desire a man. A man isn't supposed to desire pain. A person isn't supposed to desire someone of the same sex. They're supposed to desire, a man is supposed to desire a woman, is supposed to desire really just straight penile penetration of the vagina. It's kind of weird to keep saying that, but I think it's important to point out that that is the definition of good sex in terms of the politics of sexuality. So I apologize if it's weird that I keep saying that, but I think it's important to hammer that point home. So then the fourth point she talks about is the domino theory of sexual peril. And basically she talks about, this I think is really important because in this she talks about how the right, the conservative right will oftentimes say that if you allow certain sex acts to be okay, then everyone will just go around fucking everything, and it will be in chaos, and there'll be no order in the world, there'll be no reproduction, no babies, everyone will be gay. Right? This is absurd reasoning. In philosophy, we call this form of logical fallacy the slippery slope argument. Here, Gail Rubin calls it the domino theory of sexual peril. Basically, it's the idea that people use sort of narrative lines to make you afraid of ever trying anything new, afraid to try BDSM or try leather or try new things in sex and sexual experiences. She says, in contrast, this is on page 152, in contrast, all sex acts on the bad side of the line are considered utterly repulsive and devoid of all emotional nuance. So here's where she introduces this circle, and you'll see it on your page. And I think it's really, really important because this really deals with the domino theory. So if you look here, you have a line that divides the good sex from the bad sex. And so you see things like good sex is Couple, there's always two people, never three, never one, never groups, only two. Good sex is at home, never in public. Good sex is for reproduction only, never for pleasure. Good sex is monogamous, never promiscuous. I think that's going to be really important. But you have this dividing line that divides good sex from bad sex. And the idea is that if that line were to ever be faded or blurred, all chaos would ensue, right? So we need the good on the inside and the bad on the outside. Keep the bad out, away from the good. This is why we define homosexuality, right? This is why, going back to Foucault, we create discursive structures or discourse to talk about what is bad and what is good, to keep the bad out and the good inside protected. The good, coupled, vanilla, at-home, baby-making sex, safe from the outside. And I think this is important in terms of thinking about HIV/AIDS politics. And so I'm going to take a little turn away from Rubin, because I think that once we get to the circle, this is what we sort of see with Rubin. Rubin is talking about how there is this sexual politics that underlines how we understand good and bad sex. And good sex is sort of defined as heterosexual sex, and it's protected itself from bad sex. And so what this basically does is it creates a system in politics in which we create laws that define sex. Same-sex marriage laws, sodomy laws, right? I mean, Rubin's writing at a time when things like sodomy laws still existed. So you could be arrested for having anal sex when Rubin's writing this essay. And that's not even like 30 years ago, right? So I think it's important to point that out. But why I think this is important also in thinking in terms of HIV/AIDS is that you see post-HIV/AIDS a political reaction to sexual deviancy, right? So what happens after HIV/AIDS is that there's a conservative movement to make queer sexual experiences heteronormative. And there's this use of this medical condition to politically oppress, but it's because the medical condition is, in our discourse, attached to sex and sexuality, right? So as we move forward, I want you to be thinking about how HIV/AIDS as a crisis and as an experience is more than biology and more than medicine, and is specifically related to the politics of sexuality, right? So when we talk about sexuality, we can never talk merely about biology or merely about psychology. We are always talking about a political experience, because how we view sex and sexuality is political. So as we start to think about HIV/AIDS, and as it's linked to sex and sexuality, I want you to start thinking about the politics of AIDS. Because I think we really cannot talk about HIV/AIDS without talking about the politics of HIV/AIDS. And I don't just mean like Ronald Reagan being a dick about things and not funding HIV/AIDS research. I mean the actual political experience of people living with AIDS, or the actual political experience of people fighting for, people fighting against the stigmatization of HIV/AIDS. And that stigma is a political stigma, right? So this was a short lecture. There's a lot more to be said about Rubin. I'm not going to say, because I just don't have time to really deconstruct the whole article. There's a lot of great stuff about the arguments about feminist politics in there. I would really love to hear your thoughts on that, because I think there's similar arguments happening in sort of queer culture right now. This sort of arguments against conservative and more liberatory movements, and I think that that'd be a really great conversation, a really great paper topic. But for now, I just want to really focus on the politics of sexuality, and then beginning to think about the politics of HIV/AIDS as we begin to read Bersani and Foucault beginning next week, and think about this political structure as it relates to HIV/AIDS. As usual, if you have any questions, comment below. I'm sure the class would love to hear them, or email me, okay? Thanks.